Hello, welcome to Scotland at 7 on Tuesday, and tonight in the studio we have myself, Hugh, Stewart and Brian Liddy, and we're going to discuss today's news. And Brian, will begin with our top story, which of course is the Russian situation at the border of Ukraine. There's been worldwide condemnation from Russia after Vladimir Putin ordered his army into Luhansk and Donetsk areas of the Donbass region of Ukraine. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced a series of sanctions against Russia, imposing asset freezes on 5 major Russian banks and 3 high net worth individuals. Any assets they hold in the UK will be frozen and the individuals concerned will be banned from travelling here, Johnson said. The sanctioned banks are Rossija, IS Bank, General Bank, Promsyavska Bank and the Black Sea Bank, Johnson said. The 3 individuals are Gennady Timchenko, Igor Rotenberg and Boris Rotenberg. The measures mark a turning of the tide after 5 years of prevarication over the role of Russian dirty money in the UK, but still leaves many areas untouched. Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced that Germany has stopped the certification process for the controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. This morning, Germany's Energy Minister Robert Habeck instructed the withdrawal of a security of supply assessment granted under Angela Merkel's tenure, which is required to authorise a pipeline between Russia and Germany. This may sound technical, but it is a necessary administrative step without which the pipeline cannot be certified, Scholz said at a press conference in Berlin midday today. Without this certification, Nord Stream 2 cannot go into operation. Chancellor Scholz says that he has commissioned a new assessment into Germany's energy security in the light of the geopolitical developments in East Ukraine. US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said that Russia's recognition of the 2 regions of Ukraine and its decision to send troops are the start of a new invasion and put the world on the verge of a dark and dangerous era. The United States has promised severe sanctions against Russia in the event it invades Ukraine, which the White House has previously defined as any moment the troops cross the border. President Joe Biden is sending out his immediate sanctions now as we go on air. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon expressed deep concern over the actions of Russia in Ukraine. Commenting, she said that she was deeply concerned by the actions of Russia and the disturbing reports of its invasion of Ukraine. She said that the Scottish Government unreservedly condemns Russia's actions, which are in flagrant violation of international law and which further destabilise an already volatile situation. Ms Sturgeon said the Scottish Government calls for an immediate cessation of such aggressive activities with an assurance of the protection of all civilians within Ukraine. Adding, we offer our unqualified support for Ukrainian independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity and to the people of Ukraine. OK, Brian, so it's a very clear message, isn't it, that the West is standing by the Ukrainian citizens. But I think the big question for me is about the invasion which President Biden has been talking about for weeks. He's been saying, we are sure Russia is on the verge of invading. Well, haven't they done that? Is that not what they did today?
It looks like it, and certainly by word and by as much as by action. I'm sure that the Russians would say that no troops have crossed the border, but
so what they're saying is, of course, that this is a peacekeeping force and they're there to defend Russian citizens in the east of Ukraine. And as far as you know, is there any evidence that Russian citizens are in any danger?
My understanding, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I can't claim to be very well informed about this, but my understanding is that there has been shelling into Ukraine from Russia. Have any troops?
Well, that's been the pretext. Yeah, I mean the Russian sympathisers in that area have been saying that there's a lot of shelling, and we don't know who's doing it, but it's them that's doing it, isn't it? And we did report last week there was a nursery was actually shelled, but it looks as if, to me, as if the Russians are using these shellings, which their own irregulars are doing probably. They're using these shellings as a pretext to move in with a peacekeeping force. So
So these are the
And
false
there's
flags
also,
that
yeah,
we've been
in fact, there's been a
hearing
lot of
about.
false information that's been put out on the Russian media using dodgy videos of uncertain provenance. In fact, they put out videos almost before they've done it.
It's hugely concerning, and certainly the fact that now it seems that Boris Johnson has finally felt that he has to act shows perhaps how serious it really is. And of course, he's not alone internationally, as you said. We've got Biden talking about it at the moment, and in Germany there have been announcements about the pipeline, as you say. So I heard someone today talk about this in comparison to the situation that happened in Chechnya some time back. Was it in the 1980s? And this person said that the one thing the Ukrainians must not do is what the Chechens did back then. Chechnya was facing the same situation that the Ukraine's in at the moment, when there was lots of Russian troops and military might on the border, and the Chechens flinched and fired into Russian territory. And then, of course, that was the excuse that the Russians needed. And, of course, the entire Russian army then swarmed across the border into Chechnya, just razed the place to the ground, and then went home again. And so it would seem that that's the same as what the Ukraine are facing just now.
Oh, you're talking about the Georgian situation, yeah. I was in Tbilisi a few years ago when the Russians were doing something like what they've been doing in eastern Ukraine, identifying pockets where there's a lot of Russian ethnic people. In Georgia, 10, 15 years ago, the Russians have started causing trouble at the borders. In Abkhazia, the north of Georgia, the border with Russia. One thing that Putin did then was to grant Russian passports to thousands of citizens inside Georgian territories. So it's a way of softening them up and giving dual nationality, which is an extraordinary thing, isn't it? It's like somebody from Scotland going to Brazil and saying you're all Scottish citizens now, something like that. So it's a kind of a political incursion over the borders and destabilising for the country on the other side.
Yeah, I suppose it shows that it's more than just a show of might by placing arms and military material on the borders. It's a hydra, I suppose, is Putin's approach.
Yeah, but the other thing is, I was reading the other day David Pratt in the National, David Pratt, the foreign correspondent from National and the Herald, and he knows the region well. Now, I'm asking this question, is this the invasion that Biden is talking about, or is it a preliminary, or is this as far as it goes? Well, one of the things that David Pratt was saying is that in some ways, moving in so-called peacekeeping forces to the east of Ukraine is, if you like, the easiest option. So David Pratt was wondering the other day, is this the limit of Putin's interventions over there? Now let's have a look at the map of the territory, because this also there's something that David Pratt was arguing. I don't know if people can see it there though, but Ukraine, well, first of all, we've got the big Crimea sticking out in the middle there at the top of the Black Sea. So Crimea was, of course, taken over in 2015, I think it was. And the area which, 2014 was it? Yes, 2014. And the area just to the top east of that, which is the area bordering Georgia, those are the disputed territories of the Donbass. So the Russia is now in the Donbass, up in the east there, and they're also in Crimea right to the south. So the trouble is a bit in between, is still under Ukrainian control. So David Pratt was wondering whether the bit in between, which includes the city of Mariupol, that's a very important target. So I wonder whether the Russians would stop there to say, right, we've restored peace, so-called, into these Russian-speaking areas. But it certainly would be an aggressive move then if they went any further and tried to take over Mariupol. So we're wondering, well, what I'm basically saying is this as far as Putin is going to go, or is he going to continue with the invasion? We don't know anyway, but that would put the price up, wouldn't it? That would make the risk very high if Putin went any further.
I don't know if that's a very wise question to ask, to be honest. I think there's a very good chance that this will not be where Putin is going to stop. And to tell you the truth, I think if the West, if Boris Johnson and Germany and the EU and Biden had taken measures before now, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in just now. So at this stage now, to say, is this going to be the last leg for Putin? Is he going to retract after this? It's too late to be asking that question now. It's already gone too far. It's too
Well,
dangerous.
we are of course the Scottish government and everyone else in the West is denouncing this incursion because this is illegal, of course, and in fact moving into somebody else's territory, even politically, and saying that bit now belongs to our country. That's against international law, again, as the First Minister's made it clear. So this is already an act of aggression. But what I'm wondering is, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Well, just when you talk about breaking international law, then again it's just as I was saying before. If Boris Johnson and the EU and America had been stronger beforehand, but the very fact that Putin will have been paying attention for quite some time now, and he'll have been listening to the Conservative government saying that they're going to break international law in a limited and specific manner, which is what they agreed to do or stated that they were going to do in the Houses of Commons when it came down to Northern Ireland and the protocol. So that's the kind of language that Putin will look at and say, oh, well, if Boris Johnson says that it's okay for the British government to break international law, then that's fine, then I can do that too. The only thing is, like, Putin's gone ahead and acted on it in a peaceful neighbour. But so again, people that are asking, oh, this is going to be, is this going to be the end, and he's going to retract after this? It's way too late for that. It's like those are the questions that should have been getting asked quite some time ago.
Well, of course, as we've said, the Russians already moved into Crimea and they're still there. So there's nothing Boris Johnson can do to move them out of that. So let's move on to this question of sanctions then. So we mentioned earlier on the famous Nord Stream 2 pipeline going to Germany. Now that's, of course, I suppose the key thing that the European Union could do. And this pipeline has been, it's been built over several years. Angela Merkel gave permission to it. But for the whole of last year, they seem to have failed to complete the paperwork, so it seems Olaf Scholz was saying today, oh, this is very important, this is an extremely important piece of paper, but actually the politics behind that pipeline is that, well, maybe they shouldn't have built it anyway, because it means that Germany is dependent on Russian gas to keep their houses warm, right? So
it's strategically important, as you say, simply because Germany is relying on this pipeline for its gas supply. I believe that, again, I'm thinking right in saying that one of the measures that Germany has agreed to put in place is that they won't use any gas that is supplied via that pipeline, which is a major step for Germany to take. It may not sound like much, but I mean, I'm sure that apart from meaning that Germans are going to have to rely on electric heaters and microwaves for their food and heating, I'm sure that gas would also be important to industry in Germany. So this is a major step for Germany to take, and I've heard people say that it's comparable to if Britain was to put into place the Magnitsky Acts against individual Russians who have unexplained wealth, and we're not doing that. Westminster has announced sanctions against mostly banks and 3 individuals, but really, at the same time this is happening, we've got rich Russian oligarchs sitting in the House of Lords, and the Conservatives have also put together a secret lobby group, which if you pay hundreds of thousands of pounds, then you get direct, unfettered access to the cabinet. And that was happening, there were meetings taking place during Partygate. So again, Putin is just going to look at these kinds of contradictions that are coming out of Westminster and thinking, I can do what I want.
Yep, the Russian money, the Russian oligarchs' money is actually in London. Famously, London is referred to as the laundromat. It's a place to go to if you've got
he will be laughing at
he will
be laughing at Westminster and just shouting hypocrite.
So are you saying, Brian, that the Germans are prepared by refusing the Russian gas to actually pay? What that means is basically their bills are going to go up. So that hurts them, but it's a serious sanction. And are you questioning whether the UK government is actually going to take serious sanctions which would actually hurt the ruling government?
I think the British government could have done a lot more sooner. let's see how long it does take for them to actually
Now,
put
let's
the
see, what
Magnitsky
did
Act into...
Ian Blackford say about that today? Because they've, of course, Ian Blackford has a background in finance, so he knows what he's talking about. What does the S&P think should be done to tighten the sanctions?
I've got Mr Blackford's statement here today. So he says that alongside further robust and effective sanctions, we also need to see enhanced financial and defensive support for Ukraine itself. So he's saying it's not only should we be taking action against Russia and its measures, but we should be similarly supporting the Ukraine more. He also went on to say that in the days ahead, we can also no doubt expect a barrage of disinformation from the Russian media, and its proxies in the UK government should set out how it intends to combat this threat. So again, strong words from Mr Blackford, and there's been echoed, by the strong words from the First Minister.
Yeah, that is really wounding. Blackford is actually saying his proxies in the UK government. Right, that's a really strong message. But as you say, Brian, there's ample evidence of links between the Tory party and indeed Boris Johnson himself and a group, a very tightly organised group of Russian oligarchs in London. So yeah, there'll be a lot of questions to be answered over the next few months. So that's it for today. So no doubt, as I've said before, we will return to that story. And is the Russian boots on the ground in eastern Ukraine as far as they're going to go, or is that the end of the illegal occupation of sovereign territory in Ukraine? So let's move on, Brian, back home again to the Scottish Government's new approach to living safely with COVID. A new staged approach to easing protective methods will help Scotland manage and recover from the ongoing coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. In a statement to Parliament, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon confirmed the details of the updated strategic framework to manage COVID-19 primarily through public health advice, vaccination and treatment rather than legal restrictions. The First Minister also set out an indicative timescale for the remaining legal protections to be lifted. First of all, vaccination certification is no longer legally required from Monday the 28th of February, that's next Monday, although the app will still be available, so any businesses that wish to continue to certify on a voluntary basis to reassure customers will be able to do so. Secondly, current legal requirements on the use of face coverings, the collection of customers' details for contact tracing purposes, and for businesses, services, providers and places of worship to have regard to guidance on COVID and to take reasonable practical measures set out in the guidance are expected to be lifted on the 21st of March, again subject to the state of the pandemic at that time. Thirdly, access to lateral flow and PCR tests will continue to be free of charge ahead of a detailed transition plan being published on the future of Scotland's Test and Protect programme. That'll be out in March. People who test positive for COVID-19 will continue to be asked to self-isolate to reduce the risk of infecting other people. Any changes to the recommended period of self-isolation will be continued on an ongoing basis. The First Minister said, COVID is unfortunately still with us. We must therefore maintain vigilance and be prepared for the threats it poses. But today's new framework is an important moment in our recovery. It marks the point at which we move away, hopefully sustainably, from legal restrictions and rely instead on sensible behaviours, adaptations and mitigations. Our return to normality must go hand in hand with a continued determination to look out for and after each other. All of us has a part to play in ensuring a safe and sustainable recovery, so please continue to follow public health advice on getting vaccinated, testing as regularly as appropriate, wearing face coverings where required or recommended, and keeping rooms ventilated. Okay, so that's the announcement today of the strategy that's been awaited for some time. Now, there are some points of agreement with the UK strategy and there are some points of disagreement. So, well, first of all, let's, in the spirit of cooperation, Brian, we agree that we are at the end of the COVID, is that right? Are we at the end of the Omicron wave? But it's not finished yet, is it?
Is the pandemic over and is it now an endemic situation rather than pandemic? I think the answer to that question would be that the pandemic is not over and it's not endemic yet. It seems that this is all in response to yesterday's meeting or briefing, COVID briefing given by Boris Johnson and his scientific advisors, Whitty and Valence. And I would imagine that I don't know what kind of discussions would have happened between the devolved governments and Westminster before this announcement was given, but it seems basically that Scotland really has no option but to go along with the...
Well, let's look at that point. One of the points of disagreement, of course, is who's going to pay for continued testing. Now, that point was brought up today in the Scottish Parliament in response to a question from Jackie Baillie. The First Minister talked about the situation in the UK. Let's hear what she had to say.
First Minister.
Well, firstly, there isn't conflict on these issues. There is a UK government that is failing to take decisions in an orderly and a competent fashion, and that is the reality. As recently as Friday, we fully expected that yesterday the UK government would set out in detail the testing infrastructure it intended to retain and the funding that would accompany that. I had two conversations yesterday with Michael Gove, and between those conversations a UK cabinet meeting was postponed because they were still having conflict amongst themselves. Now, I deeply regret that because it has a knock-on effect on Scottish Government decision-making, and I hope they get their act together, and I hope they get their act together quickly. And Jackie Baillie is right to point to the fact that public health responsibilities are devolved, but that takes us to the very heart of the issue. Public health decisions are devolved, but decisions that determine how much resource is available to Scotland, to Wales and to Northern Ireland flow only from public health decisions that are taken for England by the UK Government. Now, that's a system I don't defend because I think it is unacceptable and unsustainable, but it's a system that Jackie Baillie and her party, unfortunately and regrettably, do defend.
OK, so there's 2 points. The First Minister was saying that she's not seeking any conflict with the UK government, but the UK government seems to be conflicted in itself. She was trying to get a clear answer from Michael Gove yesterday and spoke to him twice on, are you continuing to finance testing or not? And apparently they're still arguing. He couldn't give a clear answer. So the UK government, maybe again, we've got that debate we heard about at the weekend, a debate between the Treasury on the one hand and the Health Department on the other hand. So the First Minister is saying, I would like to know exactly what the UK government is going to do. It would be a lot easier to make our strategy that way. But sorry, I know you're about to come in there. I'll just deal with the second point because we have to move on. The second point the First Minister made, of course, is that although health is devolved, public health in Scotland is fully devolved to the Scottish Government, but the resources are not devolved. So I think that was the main point of contention, isn't it?
Yeah. What can I say? I thought the First Minister's body language was telling in that clip, but trying to address the 2 points that you raised. Yesterday there was meant to be a cabinet meeting to finalise the announcements that were going to be made that evening, last night by Boris Johnson, Whitty and Valence. The cabinet meeting was cancelled at the last minute, and rumour has it that was because there was a split between the Chancellor Rishi Sunak and the Secretary for Health Sajid Javid, because the Health Minister Sajid Javid wanted free testing to continue, and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak was against that because it's money, basically cash. And then, of course, there was, even at that time, it wasn't even clear if there was going to be any scientific input in Boris Johnson's briefing that evening. Nobody really knew if Valence and Whitty were going to be there for the actual announcement until really quite late in the day. It turned out they were there in the end, and Beth Rigby's question, I think, was the best out of that session because she basically set up the notion that there would be conflict between or anxiety on behalf of the scientists who were against freeing up, stopping testing and stopping all the restrictions, and the Prime Minister was at pains and even give jabbing says on that. It's don't try to claim that it's the scientists are on one side and politicians are on the other, and it would seem then from what then unfolded that was true, that Whitty and Valence really were quite happy to say that we really are now is the time to ease restrictions. But
Okay, but we better move on though. But so let's just underline that point. So the Scottish Government is saying that we should continue testing, not necessarily every day, but I think the First Minister said something like twice a week is recommended.
Ultimately, it's, the Scottish Government is in the unenviable position of having no option but to go along with Westminster. I'm sure that the Scottish Government, Hamza Yousaf a few weeks ago said, please don't force us to bring in contingencies by stopping free testing here in Scotland, but ultimately we have no option but to follow Westminster's, because any budgets that the Scottish Government has are already fully allocated, and if the Scottish Government is going to pay for testing to keep them free, then that would be at the expense of something else.
Yes, again, the final point the First Minister made there is that at the moment it's under a Barnett system. If money increases in England, then Scotland gets its share of that, but if they're not spending money on tests in England, then it means we don't get the money.
And that's in theory. You've heard many times the First Minister stand up and say that quite often that money has not then followed.
Okay. Right, so let's move on. Next story also to do with health, Brian. Childhood vaccination rates significantly increased in Scotland during the first lockdown compared with the year before the pandemic, according to new research. A slight decrease in numbers was also detected for uptake of vaccines in England for the same period, which is March to July 2020. This is all vaccines, it's not just a COVID vaccine. Experts say more research is needed to understand what factors potentially affect the increase in Scotland to help guide future vaccination programmes. The WHO has raised concerns that limited access to health services at the start of the pandemic would lead to a fall in childhood vaccination rates. To investigate this, the researchers from the University of Edinburgh and Public Health Scotland analysed routine health data which included the number of vaccination invites sent and appointments attended. The team found a 14.3% increase in children receiving their second dose of the MMR vaccine on time during the first lockdown in Scotland compared with vaccination levels in 2019. Timely uptake of the third jab of the 6-to-1 vaccine, the 6-in-1 vaccine, which requires 3 doses to protect against many childhood diseases, including whooping cough, increased by 9.1% in Scotland. The overall increase in vaccination equates to an additional 7,500 preschool vaccinations being delivered on time during the lockdown, compared with the same period of 2019. In England, data were only available for the first dose of MMR, which had a fall of 1.92% in uptake. There was also a 2.1% decrease in the uptake of the third dose of that 6-in-1 vaccine. Experts say that due to the observational nature of this research, it's not possible to definitely explain why these changes happened. They also advise against direct comparisons between Scotland and England because of differences in the data sets analysed. The team, however, suggests that there may be several factors linked to Scotland's boost in vaccination rates during lockdown. One possibility is that furlough or flexible working due to childcare commitments made it much easier for parents to attend the vaccination appointments. This analysis was carried out as part of the EVE2 study, which uses anonymised linked patient data to track the effect of the pandemic on the healthcare system in Scotland. So, Brian, it's good news that the uptake of all vaccinations to defeat childhood diseases has been quite high. So, as the report says, we can't read too much into exactly why. They don't really know, but still, it's good news anyway.
Yeah, and so of course, because we don't know, then anything that I might say now is just me hazarding a guess. But I wonder if people are now beginning to realise the value of vaccinations. Now that we've been dealing with COVID, they've seen that vaccinations can save lives, and that benefit is maybe cascaded from COVID down to all those childhood vaccinations that people have been avoiding because of basically scare stories, not urban myths, but put out on social media to say that it's dangerous to have these vaccinations done. So it's good then, and yeah, maybe down to some kind of logistic issue in terms of parents being able to get kids physically to the place where they get vaccinated. But I think there's maybe something wider
Okay, well,
or
it's
deeper.
probably a combination of factors
Yeah.
in there, but still, it's good to see that generally parents in Scotland are accepting the need and the effectiveness of childhood vaccinations, which certainly kept likes of you and me going through our childhood, and we're still here today to tell the tale, right? So let's move on, Brian. Now, the Borders and Nationality Bill UK had an echo in the Holyrood Parliament today. A majority of MSPs have rejected the UK Government's Nationality and Borders Bill during a debate on the UK legislation at Holyrood. This bill has been slammed by a raft of charities in Scotland, including the Scottish Refugee Council, Rape Crisis Scotland and Scotland Women's Aid, who have branded the legislation anti-survivor, anti-refugee and anti-safety. In a joint letter, these organisations go on to say this bill will kill and leave people to suffer. Only the Scottish Tories voted against rejecting the bill during the vote at Holyrood. Commenting, the SNP's Member of Scottish Parliament, who's a member of the Social Security and Social Justice Committee, the convener Eleanor Whittam said, this abhorrent bill will criminalise those seeking refuge in the UK after fleeing the most dangerous conflicts in the world. It's completely grotesque, and I welcome the Scottish Parliament rejecting this piece of legislation. We've all heard the harrowing stories of refugees fleeing war and torture by making the dangerous journey across the Channel just to seek safety. This bill would increase that danger as it would close legal and safe routes that allow for family reunion. Several dozen charities share the same concerns as the SNP on the Nationality and Borders Bill. It's one of the cruellest ever to come out of the hostile environment policy of the Home Office. The SNP has opposed this bill every step of the way at Westminster and now at Holyrood. However, the Scottish Tories have failed to oppose it. Well, not a surprise there. Not for the first time. The four parties in Holyrood backed a proposal and only one party opposed it. Well, in this case, it's the Scottish Tories supporting the UK Tories, and it's a really nasty piece of legislation. But of course, I suppose the issue for us is what effect will that have? In fact, this is what they call a legislative consent motion, which means if any of the UK legislation has some overlap into devolved areas, the Scottish Government has the Scottish Parliament traditionally has to agree to it, so they've thrown it out.
Yeah, and I think I'm right in saying that the Welsh Government had a similar debate recently, and right, they also voted not to back the bill. The situation in Holyrood, where the Conservative Party are the only ones to vote for it, kind of, to me, it kind of mimics the United Kingdom in miniature. So you've got the devolved nations are all taking different stands on things like COVID and vaccinations and now on the Nationality and Borders Bill, and one party, the Conservative Party, which is like England, then stands alone and goes against it. I'm not really making very much sense here. But one figure within the House of Commons recently who seems to have undergone some kind of rehabilitation is Theresa May. And really, I think that this is just a continuation of her toxic environment. Priti Patel has just picked up that ball and ran with it and taken it to its logical conclusion. And I would agree with the statement that you quoted there. I think it is abhorrent, and I think it's also abhorrent that the Scottish Conservative Party couldn't continue their stand against the party in Westminster and vote with their colleagues in the Scottish Government.
Okay, so that's it. So if as we expect, if the Nationality and Borders Bill continues its progress through Westminster, it does that without the support of the Scottish or the Welsh parliaments.
Yeah, and I think just quickly, I don't think it bodes very well for the Conservative Party here in Scotland with the May elections coming up. Once again, they've just seen themselves to be inconsistent, and when they start chapping on doors and start their campaign for the May elections, for the council elections, I think they're going to find it harder to kind of to make sense.
That's right. They've been trying to distance themselves from Boris Johnson, but not when it comes
it's
down to crucial votes. Okay, looking at the clock, Brian, we need more time to discuss these things, but we better move on or we'll lose the dinosaur story. Now, Westminster Police have asked a judge to exclude reporters from a hearing in which they will attempt to force a journalist and former MP who exposed the Birmingham Six's wrongful conviction to reveal his source material. The Westminster Force has applied for an order under the Terrorism Act of 2000, compelling Chris Mullen to hand over material, including notebooks from his 1985-1986 investigation into the 1974 Birmingham pub bombings, which killed 21 people and injured more than 200. The Birmingham Six were jailed for life in 1975, but their convictions were quashed in 1991. That's 5 years after the publication of Chris Mullen's book, The Error of Judgment, The Truth About the Birmingham Bombings. In 2018, West Midlands Police announced a decision to reinvestigate the case. Officers believe Mullen has interviews which could confirm the identity of a surviving member of the IRA gang now thought to be behind the pub bombings. Relatives of victims of the bombings have criticised the former MP for refusing to disclose the names of living suspects. Journalists are professionally bound to maintain the confidentiality of sources, and Mullen is refusing to disclose the requested material on the basis that it would represent a fundamental breach of this principle. The National Union of Journalists is supporting his case. West Midlands Police today confirmed that they had made submissions asking for Friday's hearing at the Old Bailey to be held in private. They cited the need to protect the privacy of a suspect whose name may be mentioned in court, who has not been charged, in line with the decision in the recent Bloomberg case at the Supreme Court, which protects such suspects. News organisations plan to challenge the attempt to have the public, including journalists, excluded from the entirety of the hearing. It is understood that Mr Mullen wishes for a hearing to be held in public. Many reporters have risked jail for contempt of court in the past rather than reveal their sources. In a significant 1996 case, the European Court of Human Rights backed a journalist from the Engineer magazine, Bill Goodwin, after a court in Britain tried to force him to reveal a source. However, in the same decision, since the Goodwin case, judges have ruled that the need for disclosure outweighed the public interest in a journalist being entitled to protect their sources. So this story, of course, has its origins in the horrible bombing in 1974 and the necessity that the West Midlands Police felt to jail somebody. So they jailed 6 Irishmen at random, it now turns out. These guys had nothing whatever to do with it, didn't even know each other. It was a ridiculous case. But the campaign to have them released did, I think, at sometimes rub up against relatives of the victims, 200 injured and 21 killed. But the campaign at the time to release the Birmingham Six pointed out to the relatives, well, wouldn't you like to see the real culprits jailed instead of these guys? Now, Chris Mullen knew who the real culprits were, or at least some of them, because he'd interviewed them from his book. But really what this boils down to is that as a journalist, do you have the right to go and approach people who have done something evil and maybe say to them, I'm going to publish, but I won't give you a name and address, but give me the story. So that means the story gets out, but only because people know that journalists are sworn to protect their sources. Is that important?
Yeah, it's maybe worth mentioning very quickly, even although time is very tight, that this was part of the IRA's terror campaign during what was called the Troubles back then, and I certainly remember it as a lad. It was shocking at the time, even for me, only being 11 years old. But now, for me, it's kind of almost unbelievable that a case that was closed, a miscarriage of justice that was righted, and you think, okay, that's draw a line under that, sorted, move on. And now it's being challenged, or maybe not challenged, but certainly it's more evidence in this country. Yeah, we're really bad at basically at whistleblowers. We don't protect whistleblowers enough, which means that things that should be highlighted aren't and continue to carry on. But yeah, and this attack on journalism that we've seen quite a lot lately, it's a prime example of that. To revive something like this at this late stage in the game, it just sounds suspect to me.
Yeah, but that and other cases, such as the Bloomberg one, which has recently been in the Supreme Court, raise the question of is there a public interest necessity to publish the names, or can journalists keep that quiet? Which, as we said, is about the journalist's ability to do their job properly. So it's balanced against the public interest to know who are the guilty people. Anyway, let's move on now to a story which we've well, actually, there's a significant date here. Tomorrow is the 23rd, is the 2nd anniversary of a vicious murder in America in the state of Georgia. In a city near, so down towards the southeast of Georgia, a Mr. Ahmad Arbery, went jogging 2 years ago. And three white men, pursued him and killed him. This is Ahmad Arbery. And the three men were already convicted of his murder. However, these three have also been found guilty today on federal hate crimes for violating Mr. Arbery's civil rights and targeting him because he was black. A jury of 8 white people and 3 black people and 1 Hispanic reached its decision today after several hours of deliberation on the charges against father and son Greg and Travis McMichael and their neighbour William Roddy Bryan. The jury also found the 3 men guilty of attempted kidnapping. The McMichaels were found guilty of the use of a firearm in the commission of a crime. US District Judge Lisa Wood told the men they have 2 weeks to file any appeal. She also said that she would schedule sentencing once the pre-sentencing reports were filed. Judge Wood praised attorneys from both sides, saying prosecutors had a difficult task of proving the racial motivation of hate crimes, which they did in a skillful and professional manner. The defence attorney, she said, represented their clients zealously, but did not volunteer to represent them, having been appointed. No one need wonder whether they got a fair trial. They did, Judge Wood said. Outside the court on Monday, Mr. Arbery's mother, Wanda Cooper-Jones, said, "I think the DOJ, that's the Department of Justice, presented its case well." During the trial, prosecutors showed about 24 text messages and social media posts in which Travis McMichael and Mr. Bryan used racist slurs and made derogatory comments about black people. The FBI was not able to access Greg McMichael's phone because it was encrypted. The McMichaels grabbed guns and jumped into a truck to pursue Mr. Arbery after seeing him running in the neighbourhood outside the Georgia port city of Brunswick in February 2020. Bryan joined the pursuit and recorded cell phone video of Travis McMichael fatally shooting Ahmad Arbery. The killing became part of the larger national reckoning on racial injustice after the graphic video leaked online. So I don't know if you recall this horrible incident 2 years ago, but a gentleman went jogging through his neighbourhood and ended up getting gunned down by 3 racists. So remember, they've already been found guilty of murder, but now in addition, they've also been found guilty in this federal court of denying Mr. Arbery's rights.
Yeah, I mean, this is to be applauded, there's no doubt about that, but at the same time, I think it was an extremely risky move to take. Retrospectively, the fact that they had already been found guilty of this man's murder, and to then, after that, to then take them to court to find out if they had infringed his human rights. If they had lost that case, then we would have been in the bizarre situation of having somebody being told that that by murdering you, we did not infringe your human rights. It's kind of a...
Yeah, well, I guess it really hinges on racism, really. I think what the court had to prove was that they didn't just shoot this guy because they thought he was a thief or they thought he was threatening their homes. They shot him because they're white racists,
yeah,
and he's black.
Yes, exactly. But then consider what would have been the outcome if they hadn't succeeded. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened, that the trial shouldn't have happened. I'm really pleased at the outcome, but I just think that those kinds of things should have been dealt with at the time with the murder trial. And
well, I'm not that familiar with the American justice system, but it does. There's 2 different channels. It looks like so. Obviously, the local authorities in Georgia prosecuted him for murder because clearly they shot an unarmed man. So no matter who he was, it's still murder anyway. But in addition, it's also a racist charge, really. So that's what's been proven today, I think. Right. Once again, let's move on, Brian. So good news story from Scotland. We hear today that a record 95.5% of pupils were in a positive destination, including work, training or further study. That's within 3 months of leaving school last year. The latest figures also show that 45.1% of school leavers went on to higher education courses at college or university, and that's the highest since records began in 2009-10. The gap between those from the most and least deprived communities are achieving a positive destination is also its lowest since 2009-10. The statistics show that for national qualifications, 87.7% of school leavers achieved at least one pass at level 5, that's national 5s or better, So that was 88% rounding up, and that's up to 86% in 2019-20. Also up from 77% back in 2009-10. Let me just underline that. That was from 77% getting a pass at National 5 just over 10 years ago to 88% now, a big increase. Also, 66% achieved at least one pass at SQF level 6, that's higher or better, and that's up from 63.9% in 2019-20 and 50% in 2009-10. Big increase there. Finally, the gap narrowed between the proportion of pupils from the most and least deprived areas leaving school with at least one pass at SQF levels 4, 5 or 6 or better. On the next point, there's one more point here. The proportion of school leavers achieving vocational awards to support them into the workplace continues to increase. Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville said, despite the challenges of the pandemic, 95.5% of pupils were in positive destinations 3 months after leaving school. This reflects the resilience and hard work of our young people and all who have supported them during the past 2 turbulent years. The narrowing of the poverty-related attainment gap shown by these figures is also very welcome. So too is the increase in the proportion of pupils gaining vocational qualifications and in those going on to higher education in college and university. So, Brian, that's further good news. I don't know if you were listening last week when I was on, but we reported too that Scotland has a very high number of people in higher education, more than I think just anybody else in Europe. So good news in education all round. Have you any comment to make?
One comment to make. One is that I would like to think I was listening because I was sat here when you covered that story last week.
Oh, was that
so
you?
I'm pretty sure I was listening. But then maybe if I was to listen back at my performance, then maybe I would say maybe I wasn't listening. No, this closing of the attainment gap is very good news, and you're absolutely right. Recently, Scotland was found, people of our generation included, were in Scotland makes Scotland one of the best educated countries in Europe in terms of going to university and the like. And of course, this is a priority for the Scottish Government. The First Minister's often said that at the end of her tenure, she wants to be judged on education. And so it looks like that judgment will be favourable.
Okay, so yes, well, in fact, if you were here, it must mean I wasn't listening to myself last week. So that's a couple of good news stories anyway. And of course, education is often used as a political football by the opposition. I think one of the issues is there's that many statistics, right? Are we doing well? Are we doing badly? It all depends on which statistics you look at.
Yeah, I think when we were last talking about this last week, I'm sure it was you and me both together, then I think I mentioned another set of figures. The name of which is escaping me. Is it the PISA?
Yes, that's
PISA,
right. Yes,
PISA
yes.
figures, which seem to they're different, but they seem to back up this general trend that education in Scotland is not getting worse, as some parties claim, but is getting better. So there's more than one set of figures, and they all seem to be showing generally a similar trend.
Well, the same applies to health, actually, because unionist parties are inclined to say, we know that the Scottish Government is failing on health, we know the Scottish Government is failing in education, but they say these things without any justification whatever. It's almost an article of faith, I think, in unionist politicians.
Yeah, and I know that time is tight, and then we probably shouldn't, it's going to sound a bit partisan, but again, quite often you'll see that on the news, there'll be a clip from First Minister's questions, and it will show a leader of the opposition, of all the opposition parties, asking fiery questions at the First Minister, but they often or rarely continue to then show the First Minister's answer. So her responses quite often are edited out of the news. Yeah, this is good news.
Yep. Oh, and again, I do remember now. Yes, I was here. We also mentioned last week that of course, the curriculum for excellence has come in during that period. So obviously, it's not really till 5 years or so till it's worked through the full population that the results show. But clearly, again, the curriculum for excellence has received some criticism. But again, with the numbers going to university, it seems to be working. It seems to be doing the trick. Right?
Yeah, and I think let's not forget that I think the Scottish Government are also putting a lot of money into apprenticeships. and they're saying that it's not that we're insisting that young people go to university as soon as they leave school. So again, I'm sure that's part of the wider mix as well.
Okay, so moving on, we've got plenty of time, I think, to discuss the dinosaur story coming up in a minute. I'm looking forward to that one. But first, an industry which we don't hear very much about, but it's a growing one, seaweed. A new report outlining future options for the Scottish seaweed industry has been welcomed by Scottish Government ministers. Sustainability of the sector is key to any future development, with harvesting of some kelp species already banned. The global seaweed industry is estimated to be worth 8.1 billion euros per year, with Asia dominating the cultivated seaweed industry. In Scotland, the review found the sector delivers an estimated gross value added of £510,000 and employs around 60 people, with small artisan-type businesses leading the domestic sector. However, projections estimate that this figure could increase substantially by 2040. Popular as a cooking ingredient, seaweed is also used in pharmaceutical and cosmetic industries. This mapping exercise was undertaken by the Seaweed Review Steering Group, an organisation with representatives from the fisheries, conservation, science, biotech and the seaweed industry sectors. The view highlights the need for comprehensive policy and robust legislation around planning and licensing of the sector to deliver environmentally sustainable development. So that's interesting, this report, Brian. It says on the one hand that the seaweed industry is really, really small. It's a small handicraft kind of industry, but it could grow. But it's also saying it can grow in an unsustainable way. I guess we've got the situation that you could kill the goose that lays golden eggs if you harvest too much at one go.
Yeah, I remember on trips to Ireland that there used to be a quite popular snack called dulse, which is basically just dried seaweed. So it is in its own right a foodstuff. And I'm sure I'm also right, I didn't get a chance to check, but I'm sure I'm also right that seaweed is used in brewing. I think it's seaweed or something in seaweed that gives makes the head on a pint of lager, or the froth that you get. I'm sure that is down to some part of seaweed. You also often hear stories that it's perhaps going to provide a biodegradable alternative to plastic. And you mentioned pharmaceuticals, so I think they're talking about alternative antibiotics and the like. And if you think about Scotland's extremely long coastline, then we're ideally placed to add this to Scotland's already long list of alternatives, in terms of sustainability and wind power, solar, and this is good. And I'm sure there was a recent story about somebody was considering applying for a contract to harvest seaweed off the coast of Scotland, but their proposal was knocked back because they were just intending to just rip up the entire seaweed roots and all, and they weren't allowed to have it because it was agreed that really it should be sort of leave the roots and the stem and just harvest the fronds so that it continues to grow, and rather than just ruining the seabed by ripping it up wholesale.
I don't know a great deal about seaweed cultivation, but it seems sense to me. Like lettuce, if you take the leaves and let the plant keep growing,
exactly. I think
you get more.
I think it's quite a hot topic, basically, that maybe we don't hear more about. And this thing about it, I think you almost implied that it was a small industry, but again, people said that about the Scottish fishing industry until recently. But the only reason that it was a small part of Britain's economy was because it wasn't supported with funding. It was an incredibly important sector that was totally high end and was people paid extra for Scottish seafood, and I don't see why that shouldn't be the case for Scottish seaweed.
But the interesting thing about the group is that it's taking advice from different sectors, including the fishing industry, because presumably any increase in harvesting the seabed is going to have a knock-on effect on fishing. So, of course, as you often get in environmental policy, it has to be a balance of interests. So the fishing and other interests are represented in the new group.
I'm sure there's enough space for both the fishing industry and the seaweed industry. It's like there's a lot of sea out there, so it shouldn't be a problem. I guess
that's what I mean by the sustainable development, trying to do it in a planned way. Now, it's just about time, Brian, to discuss our dinosaur story. Would you like to hear that one?
Please.
Well, a spectacular fossil of a huge flying reptile known as the pterosaur, that's with a silent P, was found on the Isle of Skye. It's the largest of its kind ever discovered from the Jurassic period. The giant winged creature, more popularly known as a pterodactyl, lived around 170 million years ago and had an estimated wingspan of more than 2.5 metres. The fossil is the best preserved skeleton of a pterosaur found in Scotland, experts say. The species has been given the Gaelic name of Diarc Skianach, which translates as winged reptile, and also references the Isle of Skye, whose Gaelic name means the winged isle. You knew that, didn't you, Brian? The unique specimen discovered during a National Geographic Society funded excavation in 2017 will now be added to the National Museum of Scotland's collection and studied further. The find is described in a new paper published in the Current Biology, authored by scientists from the University of Edinburgh, the National Museums of Scotland, the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow and the University of St Andrews, and also the Staffin Museum on the Isle of Skye. Lead author, the University of Edinburgh PhD student Natalia Jagielska, said, "The Ark is a fantastic example of why paleontology will never cease to be astounding. Pterosaurs preserved in such quality are exceedingly rare and usually reserved to select rock formations in Brazil and China, and yet an enormous, superbly preserved pterosaur emerged from a tidal platform in Scotland. After the fossil was salvaged, it was brought to the University of Edinburgh for analysis and description. CT scans of the skull have revealed large optic lobes which indicate that the Ark would have had good eyesight. Pterosaurs were the first vertebrates to evolve powered flight some 50 million years before birds. They lived throughout the Mesozoic era, the so-called age of the reptiles, as far back as the Triassic period, which is 230 million years ago. That's a fascinating scientific story there. So I don't know what you want to say about that.
Probably quite a lot. I think it's a great story, and I'm really pleased that we did find the time to fit it in. For a start, I mean, it does conjure up images from movies, the likes of Jurassic Park, and what Scotland would have looked like at that time. But it's also worth maybe noting that Scotland at that time would not have been part of the UK. Scotland is closer, part of the same continental shelf that Iceland is on, and Greenland and we were closer to North America. So the fact that you said that these dinosaurs were more common and their fossils are more commonly found in Brazil kind of makes sense to me, in the sense that Scotland drifted as part of continental drift until it abutted up against Europe, which was coming the other way, and that's how we ended up joined on to England, which is part of the European continental plate. And it's also really interesting because I don't think people realise that even geologically, not even politically, Scotland is a completely different country from England. It's like the rock formations in Scotland are much, much older than the rock formations or the geology that you'll find in England. And I don't know how much time I've got left. Looks nervously over his shoulder at the clock. But this is the kind of thing that gets kids into museums. It's that, I've taken young cousins and nieces and nephews to the likes of Kelvin Grove, and when I want to go upstairs and take them to look at the paintings, they all just want to stay downstairs and look at mummies and reptiles. So it's good that there's such a fine example found here in Scotland. And it also, I mean, and who would have known that they had googly eyes? So the fact that shows that this is a really detailed specimen that they'll be able to extract a lot of scientific information from.
Yep, thanks. I didn't know all of that, Brian. That was good. I'm glad we got that in. So that's another interesting, fascinating story to end on there. Okay, so that is our final story for tonight. So I'm back tomorrow. And I don't know if you are, Brian, but maybe you'll be in the control room tomorrow. So we've just got finally to thank you for watching, and a special thank to our subscribers, because it's you that's keeping Broadcasting Scotland on the air. Now, if you look at the link below here, then it would be great if you'd consider being one of our subscribers. If you look on the website, for starting at £5 a month, you can become one of the team that keeps Broadcasting Scotland and our programmes on the air. We have bills to pay, and of course, like everybody else, the bills are going up. It's getting very expensive to keep the lights on in here. and it really doesn't work when we've got only candles in the studio. Right, so I'll just finally remind you all that this is actually an auspicious date as well, because it's Tuesday. Today it is, it's all the twos, isn't it? It's the 2nd of 2222. So that's it from me and Brian for tonight. So thank you for watching. So I'll be back at Scotland at 7 tomorrow. Okay, good night.